Welcome to Data Forward, the podcast that keeps you ahead in the fast-evolving world of enterprise AI and data management. We bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and the latest trends to help you stay on top. Ready to shape the future of data? Let's Data Forward.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Data Forward. I'm your host, Ramon Chen, the Chief Product Officer at Acceldata. And with me today is Wil Pong of Fiddler. Welcome, Wil.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too. And it's a beautiful day to be in the Bay, as we were just discussing before the start of the podcast. You're outdoors, I'm indoors. But we're here to talk about AI observability and how both of the cousins, if you will, AI observability and data observability work well together. But first of all, give us a little bit of history, Wil, about your career so far and how did you end up as VP of Product at Fiddler?
Yeah, that sounds great. So for me, I've been in the product space for over a decade, and I worked as a UX designer before that. Largely starting in my career in big tech, working on enterprise platforms. So whether that was big data or sort of business systems internally at places like Netflix and Uber, moved on to sort of understand how to build teams and be a leader at some really great places like Box and Amplitude, having GM type responsibilities to own product as well as the overall strategy and P&L. And so kind of combining those pieces of serving developers and data as well as in the enterprise, the thing that really stood out to me at Fiddler was, hey, we have an opportunity to pull together all of those experiences for the new wave that's coming, right? And as we've all experienced, AI is an incredible explosion and the focus of our conversation today. So I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to be the helm of something that was changing how both developers and data folks will actually evolve with AI in the future. And that's
fantastic. Yeah. And Fiddler, one of the hottest companies out there, together with Acceldata, we're in the data observability space. You're in the AI observability space.
Yes.
So tell the audience out there, what is AI observability?
Yeah. So I think the best place to start is to say that AI is broader than, what the sort of latest zeitgeist is, right? As much as we love OpenAI and Anthropic, and that's a huge piece of it, frontier models, AI comprises all of AI development, right? Whether it's predictive models in your organization. Imagine you're a bank that has an underwriting model or fraud detection model, or a healthcare company that has computer vision. That also extends to in-house LLMs that you might create for your own vertical, right, out of open weight models that are out there. And then finally, the utilization of frontier models or anything that I've mentioned up until now, and folding that into applications like agentic applications, for example, that can drive sort of AI use cases in your organization. So when you think about those three major use cases, you'll start thinking about the data underneath that looks different than your average, let's say product analytics, telemetry, or instrumentation. You have to have a platform that understands the kind of information that those tools emit and can make sense of those in data visualization and explore those then to understand what's going well, what's not, and go build the best tools you can.
Fantastic. And then so Fiddler specifically handles all those three types. The most sort of prevalent, as you mentioned today, are the use of large language models and
That's
such,
right.
which has really, I don't want to say legitimizes AI because AI was already legit, but simplified it for the layperson as well as those, even in our line of business, leveraging agentic capabilities and large language models. What's the kind of metrics that typically, let's just take the LLM example, people look to observe and detect for in AI observability?
Yeah, so you made a good point about this sort of shift in AI, right? Normally, when we see technological leaps, it's either making things dramatically simpler or making things dramatically more capable. This is the first time in a very long time in the industry we've actually seen dual leaps in both, right? Mm-hmm. And so to your point, what's happening, I mentioned the term agentic earlier. The use cases now allow us to use large language models to actually automate work, right? And further than automate work, can actually replace work to the decisioning piece or the judgment piece and kind of like move forward and create these things called non-deterministic systems. So tying that back to your question about what metrics we have to measure, starting with the agentic side, you need to actually understand both aspects of your application. On the one hand side, it might look like application performance management. Anyone who's familiar with a Datadog or a Dynatrace, this is what you're trying to do on that side, right? Understand latency, errors, ROI, spend, those types of things. But on the other side, that's Fiddler's heritage, understanding model performance, whether it's your predictive models and if they're drifting in their information or if they're sort of accurate in their recall, or it's LLMs that are actually measuring for things like hallucinations or toxicity or things like that. Those two types of metrics have to come together in order to understand one agentic app. Because you'll want to know if your LLM is making up responses, but you'll also want to know if your tool calls are failing. So how do you do that in one session? You've got to pull it all together. And that's why, as we mentioned, Fiddler being a unified observability platform, we started from the world of models. We understand agentic developers, want to bring it all together. And so those are the type of metrics that matter.
That's tremendous because obviously you know that Acceldata data observability is actually in between those two worlds, to speak, right? So you talked about Datadog's observability on application performance monitoring. Data observability, which is what Acceldata does, focuses in on the quality of the data, the precursor to these models being fed, the reliability of the data. And the metrics there are obviously the degree of quality, freshness, the information, is it relevant contextually, and are there any anomalies in terms of the patterns of the data before it gets fed into the AI systems, as well as dashboards and reports and other applications. So I mentioned at the beginning, we're kind of like cousins here because we feed the data into the AI and the LLMs, then you subsequently observe. And we also observe the data to make sure and ensure the trust and reliability. So the two work very well together. Let's talk a little bit about sort of, the new age of adopting AI, again, particularly in the large language model scenarios. How are people deciding between, Anthropic and Claude and Anthropic's Claude and OpenAI and all these different LLMs? How are you seeing people think about corporate adoption? Are they using more than one, like cloud providers? Are they going for more than one? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think at the heart of it, some of the beauty of this kind of agentic app development is how modular it is. So to your point, you can swap out model providers in a very easy and seamless way. You may have built an application and have certain prompts or routes that you have going on. But if you wanted to try what that setup or configuration looks like on Gemini 2.5 versus Claude Sonnet 4, or of course, ChatGPT 5 was just announced last week, maybe you want to try that. This process is what we call evaluations for agentic developers. You want to test out different platforms, different prompts, different aspects of your toolkit in order to sort of see what will work best for you. And sometimes what's best is not just the best performance, right? One might be 95% as good as the other, but at a tenth of the cost. Maybe that makes sense for your organization. So having evaluations that can sort of look across many different dimensions or factors is really important. So some of those are the metrics that I mentioned earlier, right? Is it performing well? Is it safe? Do you get good ROI? But when you see that across the different configurations, that's how you make a decision. That said, we have seen a trend with a lot of enterprise customers that we work with, and it's what I call hyperscaler consolidation, right? I may already be building my app, my distributed cloud app on AWS, and that makes sense for me to try Claude on Bedrock because it's in my organization. I'm not sending data over the internet to a cloud endpoint. It's all within my environment. And I'm now building something that is more secure by design, right? Rinse and repeat. If you're a GCP customer, you might be trying Google ADK and Gemini and Vertex and Microsoft, of course, OpenAI with Azure and Foundry and so on. So some of this hyperscaler consolidation is happening at large enterprises. At smaller companies, I think what we're seeing is independent players like LangChain driving a lot of the agentic building and orchestration, and then folks playing around with a lot of different model providers and seeing what works for them.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you because in our own development here at Acceldata, where we released Agentic Data Management, as you know, a couple of months ago, and we had Krishna on, your CEO, on a panel with me talking about sort of the synergies and the evolution. We offer the same, right? We offer your choice of LLMs, pick and choose. But with AI observability, do you actually allow for tracking, auditing, and a corpus of comparison across different LLMs? Is that something that you do by turning it on and then using your observability capabilities in a side-by-side mode or some level of comparison?
That's exactly right. And so this is the sort of evaluations or evals for short kind of workflow that we talked about, right? It's the ability, there's a couple of ingredients to this. One is you're going to want a great data set, and that's maybe part of the Excel data story, right? Clean golden set inputs where you say, look, let's imagine a customer service bot for a moment, right? I may have 20 different scenarios where customers may ask you for things, right? What's your pricing policy? I have an issue. How do I escalate and so on? And then you'll have some sort of expected set of outputs that serves as your ground truth, right? Hey, this is how we think the agent should respond given this situation. That's what we call a sort of final output evaluation, right? No matter how all the agents work, at the end of the day, it'll spit out an answer. And I'm going to run some evaluators on it, right? That could be a simple judge to say, hey, I'm going to grade this and say, is this answer close or expected to my ground truth? Or it could get actually really deep and say, is my app performing in ways that it wasn't supposed to? Did it miss the tool call that it was supposed to do, and so on? That's the concept. And you need to sort of build a suite around that for developers to understand how to build great things. But on the other side, as you move into production and you start monitoring, every log that you sort of generate as part of these agentic apps will not just have actions from the end user, but it'll actually have this metadata as well. So you'll know for every action what model, what provider, what sort of moment was for action to action, what you did and why. And you should be able to sort and filter through those to discover issues or find optimizations as you need to. So Fiddler provides both of those experiences, both evaluation, pre-production, and as you get into production monitoring, these sort of root cause analysis tools that can filter by this metadata to find what you need.
That's fantastic. So one of the major questions, and it's evolving, is cost, right, of operating a large language model, the amount of tokens it consumes. As these things get more and more sophisticated, they either use fewer tokens, smaller language models, and so on and so forth. Does Fiddler provide that level of context as well? Can you do sort of a cost judgment, same prompt, same question? What is the net cost in returning a reasonable response? Is that something that you provide?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes, but let me maybe riff on this a little bit.
Sure.
Where I think we've seen some shallow solutions in the market where they'll say something like, let me just grab list price for AWS and I'll multiply that by your tokens. And suddenly I know your cost as an organization. Acceldata does not have an average rate card with AWS or GCP or whoever else, right?
Sure.
You have your own prices for things. You have your own sort of different structures of things, even potentially. So the best thing to do is often to actually pass that as an attribute as part of your logs and data, so that can actually be used to calculate an actual cost metric for your organization, right? Otherwise, what you have is consumption and pricing, but it's not a real meter for your org. And great data leaders will understand that. They'll look at it and inherently say, that number is crazy. I can't trust that. I'm just going to go somewhere else and try to cobble it together.
Right? Relatively speaking, because you want on a consumption basis, you want to have that level of understanding and security.
That's right. But you do point out a positive thing, which is by and large, when you do agentic development, especially if you use frontier models like the OpenAIs and Anthropics of the world, that is very clearly understood usage-based pricing, just as AWS kind of revolutionized that for cloud spend, right? So you can sort of quantify the ROI or quantify the cost over time, right? You can start saying to yourself, I'll give you an example. When I was at Netflix, one of the things I owned as a product person was our customer service stack. And we had a decision to make, which was, do we continue to operate these high quality but high cost call centers? Or do we actually move to chat, which is, potentially lower in quality, but much less to serve, right? And we knew on average, calls cost about $7 per call. And we knew that chats cost something like 15 cents per call. And that was a mix of, cogs and engineering on the chat side, right? Versus human beings picking up the phone with an hourly wage. It's not so different with agents, right? You have folks that are performing actions. This may be agentic instead of human, but same idea. And so you can measure them from their token spend on a particular action they make. And imagine now, over the course of 100 sessions, you start seeing anomalies. Why was this one actually 4 or 5 times higher token spend than this other one? Let me dive in and see if there's something broken in this scenario so that I can fix it and actually fix my cost basis so I don't have a lot of this going on. that's the role that AI observability has in this whole mix, right? Let me tell you what's going right and wrong at scale so you can actually go fix those issues.
That's terrific. One of the things that we had discussed before we got on air here was AI governance and enterprise policies that are kind of evolving, right? I'm sure the lawyers are having a field day sort of thinking about, what should I put in contracts that protects the intellectual property of customers who will have their data or their applications exposed to AI. How are you seeing those being crafted? Is there an emerging standard of, like with SaaS contracts? It's essentially when Salesforce first came up with SaaS, those were the gold standards. When you created your own licensing agreement, you copied the Salesforce one, and you basically made your edits, right? Is there an emerging standard that you've seen? How are these things progressing?
Yeah, I think one thing we're seeing a lot with corporate policies is actually driven by government, right? There are things like EOAA Act that will sort of recently come out that have very strong perspectives on how data should be used, retained, governed, and so on. There are also professional frameworks like ISO 42001 that sort of seek to define some of these things for AI as well. And so there are times when we'll see that pattern. A company will come to us and say, hey, these are the AI standards. Can you help me enforce them? I'm going to build controls off of these policies. So, the number one thing I have to do as a governance or compliance leader is actually produce evidence that my controls are working. And so how do you produce evidence? You observe, right? And say, look, these metrics that Fiddler has, and the fact that they can give me a real-time chart that shows how these are calculated, I can show you, auditor, that all of May 2025, we did great when it came to hallucination, just as we promised in our control that it would be under X%, we got there. Or, hey, I can show you that every time there was an instance of PII, we redacted that in our response so that there would be no leakage. Here's a random sampling of sessions where we did it. Have a nice day. And so it's really important for governance and observability to be best friends because from top down governance, you're sort of cataloging all of the different use cases and maybe producing evidence for how those use cases are in compliance with your policies. And then from the bottom up, as developers, as builders, you're using observability in order to build the best app you can. So now observability can sort of be a bridge between your builder teams, like data and developers on the one side, and GRC teams on the other, and actually work together to produce a better outcome for enterprises.
No, that's really insightful. I think one of the things that I really was curious about is what kind of guardrails. You have a capability or product module called guardrails. How does that work exactly? I know people would be aware of just, protecting from PII data, which is what Acceldata does as well. So hopefully we've scrubbed it. We will have scrubbed it before it gets to you. But to the extent that somebody's keying in information, interacting with a prompt engine of some sort, you capture and you form that line of defense, right? How does that work?
So this is the difference between surgery and preventative medicine, right?
All right.
And I'll say this, like no one wants to be in the ER. So I'm going to talk about that scenario in a little bit.
Sure.
But, so much of what Acceldata is able to do is also a kind of preventative medicine. Before the data ever enters your system, let's scrub it and make sure it's clean from day one so you don't have to deal with those issues, right? Guardrails are another aspect of preventative medicine, and that's really more in your runtime. So when you think as an application developer, these systems are different than what was before. When I was writing code for my app last year, I told it what to do. I knew the 3 different paths it might take, and I can actually write in rules for what to do, when, and why, right? Agents, the reason why they're agents and not just LLMs is they have this aspect of reasoning and non-determinism. You don't know on any given sort of scenario what the application is going to do, right? And so you need to understand, for the inputs that go into that application, can you protect it from bad data before it even enters your pipeline, right? As the user is using your application, can you detect things like a jailbreak attempt? Or can you detect toxic content? Yes, that's what a guardrail is for on the input side. On the output side, you're protecting your organization from saying the wrong thing to the user and causing issues. And without naming names, I think we've all seen examples of large language models out there that have said some really unsavory things or
Sure.
emulated some not so admired world leaders in the past. I'll kind
Yeah.
of leave it there, right? That is an example of a product that lacks output guardrails, right? You should be able to say, I'm about to say something offensive, or I'm about to say something that's out of company policy. Let me stop that. It could be universally offensive, or it could be as simple as saying, my agent shouldn't mention any of my competitors by name in their response. Let's scrub for that. So that's what guardrails do, right? On the input and the output side in runtime, real time, can you detect these issues and avoid bad outcomes? Whereas I think the scale of something like Acceldata is at a data lake level, or at sort of like an overall corpus or catalog of my data. Am I making sure that I'm sort of following the right policy there? Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense, and super interesting to boot. I think getting a little bit more nuanced, right? Because I'm sure our listeners who are thinking about this, typically with Acceldata, we can observe data sources, tools, pipelines, but we have to plug in, right? Just like anybody, to harvest the metadata and to observe sort of the behaviors and the data of the pipelines, as well as the quality of the data, and harvest the metadata. How does AI observability work? So I'm imagining examples of a chat interface calling OpenAI frameworks. You would interject yourself in between the submission of the prompt and the output, and process the output coming back. But when you're dealing with somebody that's embedded AI already in the system, do you need those endpoints or exit points to tap into? So let's say today, does Fiddler observe Salesforce agents, for instance, and how they're behaving? And what do you need at Fiddler in order to be incorporated into that observability?
Yeah, that's a good meaty topic. I think there's a couple of things there that I would reflect back to you. There's sort of first-party agentic development where you're using developer tools in order to create agents. I mentioned LangChain as an example earlier. There are other tools like that are out there, as well as hyperscalers, right? AWS has Strands, Google has ADK.
No problems there.
Right. So that's first-party development. And like you said, that could be as simple as providing an SDK, or some of these platforms will even allow you to send, they already have the logs in the right format. We call it open telemetry, or OTel for short. You can actually configure a collector, of which Fiddler builds one, and you can just send logs directly to it as exhaust as the app is working, right? So it's a parallel path. On third-party development, it really depends on how open or not they are, right? And just to like land the analogy for viewers here that may not have worked on agentic apps, can you imagine if you're the head of IT 10 years ago and you're running Microsoft Word 365 in your organization? Could you go to Microsoft and say, I want to know every time somebody clicked on bolding some text? They're not going to give you those application logs, right?
Right.
But interestingly, in the agentic world, in this sort of AI first application development, we're seeing tools like Agentforce from Salesforce. They just announced at the end of June that they have OTel support pushing into their data cloud from the very beginning from their platform. So you're seeing sort of this new age of development embrace standards much more early. And that actually helps all of us in the ecosystem bring value much quicker then, right? Because if Salesforce is pushing OTel logs into Data Cloud, and something like Acceldata is connected to Data Cloud, which I'm sure you can. Same thing for us. If we're connected there, or a customer wants to push all of that into a place that we can reach, like an S3 bucket or something like this, it's all up for grabs, right? As long as an application platform is willing to expose its logs in order for us to understand them, we're in a great place. That's the nice thing about these interoperable standards here.
Yeah, I hear you. I think, one of the amazing things about the speed in which AI is being adopted today is that in order to get everybody comfortable, every single vendor like Acceldata and Fiddler and Salesforce, we all have to be transparent, because people expect transparency and interoperability. So the fact that, Salesforce has announced this is great for the industry. I would expect nothing less, right? From Mark Benioff. But the situation here is that the industry is feeding upon itself in terms of the level of interoperability and transparency. People are not hoarding. The walled garden scenario was compared with, in the early days of before the internet took shape, right? Everybody, AOL had their walled garden with their content and so forth. Now it's all open. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
exciting to see that kind of development. I'll just give you two quick examples and we can move to another topic.
Yeah.
Anthropic introduced this concept of MCP, right? This
That's right.
interoperable protocol that allows agents to talk to agents or agents to call tools and so on.
That's right.
It's sort of a way for agents to plug into other kind of assets, right?
Yeah.
That's open source and shared with the community. And
Yeah.
so when you start to think about like there's different contributors to this across the board, it also comes back to your earlier question about is everyone sticking to one platform or just doing one thing, right? Not necessarily. There's a lot of mix and match that's happening here. And that's one exciting thing about how AI is evolving is that both on the data layer, but also the operative layer, we're seeing some open standards and consolidation. It's great.
Yeah. Well, that's the topic I was going to go to, actually. So in terms of MCP, Acceldata has also introduced our MCP server because we want to be open, allow people to share our metadata, as well as plugging into other MCPs as well as options. What does AI observability and Fiddler do with supporting the observability of data coming from MCPs? Is there any additional context that's needed, or is it just treating it as additional feeds coming in?
So here's the interesting thing. Everything I said before with these agentic platforms emitting logs, it's all true. But every platform can only see what it kind of owns itself, right?
Yep.
When it makes any kind of tool call, MCP or otherwise, what you'll see in the data format is something simple. They'll say something like, tool input, tool output. That's all you really get. You might get a null output if the tool didn't work or something like that. But the tool itself, that MCP server itself, can be a black box.
Yeah.
So the question would be, in this case, we might say something like, will Acceldata actually share its OTel logs of the processes that you did to actually help the agent do what it was supposed to do? And then, most importantly, can your observability tool stitch those things together? Can we actually say, we understood because we saw this agent call Acceldata. We know Acceldata's logs. Let's hydrate that. Whether it's as simple as the attributes I mentioned earlier, we could append a few things, or it could be as complex as fully exposing your logs to make that work. That's sort of what we need to cobble together now and understand this use case. That's where observability helps when it comes to MCPs. Now, importantly, every sort of action or event that we've talked about so far, there's sort of an industry standard term called stans or span events. So each one of these span events can have different types. This could be an LLM reasoning or a tool call or a chain or something like this. And we see MCP server access as like one of those types. So being able to then construct that sort of hierarchy or the lineage of how your app worked, what path it took for a given session, that's also observability's job because that could be different from session to session. So we should reconstruct that for you and tell you in this case, hey, great, they did call Acceldata, they got clean data, that was great. In this case, they did not call it or called it improperly, didn't receive a data set response or something like that. Observability tools should be able to tell that story.
Who's your typical buyer, right? So there's people in the engineering department, the governance department, the compliance department, people who are the owners of the app. Who do you typically see come to you and say, hey, I need Fiddler because, I'm aware that there's a gap in terms of, not observing anything from an AI behavioral perspective on these models. So who typically would think Fiddler when it comes to sort of picking up the phone and giving you guys a call?
The short answer is we're starting to discover that it's a team sport, right? There are multiple departments that really show up. So it's not really just any one team. Now, traditionally, especially it was started in ML and then went to LLMs, we often dealt with a persona that was like a chief data officer or a chief AI officer, right? Or you may even get the head of machine learning infra or something like that. Folks that were responsible for the underlying pipes and data infra in order to make things work. So that's where life started. But increasingly, as practitioners kind of came on, whether that's on the data science and ML side, or you would get the developers now, as we talked about agentic, these folks are also coming to the table and saying, we need to consume this for our own reasons as we develop things, not just as things go into production. And so even though many of our conversations start with data leaders, we end up working a lot with the CTOs of the world or the VP engines of the world or product of the world to kind of pull together that story. The other thing I would say is, and we touched upon it a little bit earlier in the conversation, increasingly we're seeing energy from CISOs or from security side of the house, right? Where folks are saying, hey, for my reasons to keep our company safe and compliant, I also need to see this. And so building that bridge between those two personas is really important for us, but also is a great way for us to serve our customers. So as much as it starts with data, you see developers and you see security as sort of the triumvirate. Not too surprising. This is what DevSecOps is, right? Just for the AI age.
For sure. It's amazing. There's a lot of parallels here in terms of data observability and AI observability. We too see the evolution of traditionally a data engineering team wanting data observability to do the back end work, but increasingly governance and data governance and compliance, and chief data officers obviously care about the quality and the trust of their data, but it is a democratized concern, right, for both data and for AI. Hence, both our companies are seeing, as you put it, team sport ways of requesting and evaluating these technologies. To close, Wil, I think there's a lot of synergies between data observability and AI observability. We're all part of this sort of like data supply chain, if you will.
Yeah.
The food chain, and it's the circle of life, right? In terms of reusing the active metadata to make the LLMs be more intelligent and so on and so forth. How do you recommend people get started with AI observability? Because from a data observability perspective, we tell companies just install us and observe, right? Because from then you can decide what governance policies you need, what quality needs fixing, which is the data that's your customers care most about in terms of your end users and what's most valuable. Just observing dictates what you should do next. I'm sure it's very similar with you. Install it and then figure out what are the guardrails you need to put in place and so on and so forth. How do you get started, and how do you recommend people get started?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. We share the same DNA, which is, you make the data flow and everything goes from there. Yeah. Now, to be clear, I think for both of our teams, we understand the downstream use cases of that data, and you want to prepare folks for that, right? So for us, if we think about sort of data science type practitioners, are we setting up the right dashboards that allow them to sort of dive deep into their models, discover where things are anomalous or not? Let's sort of pave the path downstream. But none of that matters if you don't have clean data coming in, right? You can have a Michelin star chef, but if they're, buying food from the deli instead of from a farmer, like it's going to taste like bad, right?
Great.
And so that's the idea there. It does start there. The other thing I would say is, as you work with developers and make dev tools, the nature of how data flows is also different, right? These core ML pipelines are these sort of like, big mechanisms to sort of manage data at scale for organizations. Looks different for a developer that's just doing one app, right? So that actually might be as simple as a one-line install of an SDK, and data is flowing directly from the application in real time. So marrying those two things become really important, right? In parallel, does it flow to a data lake as well as to something like Fiddler? So we can give operational excellence as well as circle back for bigger trends. That's something that might happen. And so I would say that's where we sit, is we get an opportunity to sort of help see this data in a more real-time aspect and start helping developers develop as well.
Excellent. Well, it's been terrific having you on. I really appreciate all your insights. I think the audience here really got a better sense of what AI observability really is and the amazing things that Fiddler is delivering. And it's great to partner with you guys from data observability to AI observability. I think we have the tools and the platform that will benefit enterprises globally. So thank you again.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Welcome to Data Forward, the podcast that keeps you ahead in the fast-evolving world of enterprise AI and data management. We bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and the latest trends to help you stay on top. Ready to shape the future of data? Let's Data Forward.